I'm David Beckmann, and I'm pleased to introduce Eric Sapp. He is the founder and president of Public Democracy. Digital technology has had some bad effects on our politics and our religious life. But Eric is a pioneer in the use of digital technology and artificial intelligence for good purposes. He's recruited a lot of faith-based voters for good causes, often progressive causes. And he's also using it to empower disenfranchised people to express what they want, what they believe, and have an impact on the things that are important to them. I first saw the power of digital technology when Eric worked with Bread for the World in 2016 in the elections. Bread for the World sent little digital ads to 26 million voters in 10 swing states. About 2 million voters took action in response. But what really surprised me was that even the people who never took any action, just saw those little ads, those people in large numbers, more of those people said that hunger is an important issue. It's an important election issue. The big technology companies have shaped social media to make money for themselves. But what Eric's been doing, you'll see through a series of experiences, he's been following a different principle that that technology should be used not just to sell people things or sell people ideas, but especially to listen to them and to learn from them what's really important to them. I think we need to get our government to figure out ways to make this kind of digital technology much more widespread. Eric Sapp.
There is one other element to the story you told, David, that's really important, and it reflect on some of the things we're doing now too. It wasn't just support. There was, I think I remember these numbers right, but it was about 12% of the population that opposed, that said the federal government had no role in combating hunger. And to me, back then, one of the most significant pieces of that was that number went from 12 to 2%, based on these engagements. And this, especially with a lot of the work we've been doing recently on countering disinformation side, is a really important piece to understand as well. It's not just, hey, how do we convince people that we're right, or how do we win up, or mostly, what is being done a lot right now, rev up our base to get more angry or more whatever. A lot of it is, it opens up opportunities to engage and open conversations with others. And we're also working, I'll talk about these the two new big things. We're doing a big campaign on vaccine hesitancy, which is the same concept. And I think we'll have an interesting conversation on the whole vaccine piece, but the core of what we're doing there, and we're working with Urban League and National Minority Equality Forum and Congressional Black Caucus and others to address vaccine hesitancy, particularly in the African American community, but more broadly as well, was all the campaigns that are being run right now were run out of, like, their vaccine hesitancy campaigns. And everyone said, how do we get people to get vaccinated? That's what we want. So my goal in the campaign is I need to get these people who don't want to get vaccinated to get vaccinated. And that's why they're not working, because communication can never be, it's not what I want to say, it's what are people able to hear. And to bring it real quick down to all the MDivs and everybody here in this context, like, it is relational. And you can even talk, like, to me, as I've looked in data and the way that we engage, almost incarnational in this idea of our goal is understanding. And it's when you establish deep understanding, and with the way we engage digitally as well, which is very different from traditional ad tech, we meet people in the moments where everything we're doing is about meeting a need, not reshaping a behavior. And so our vaccine hesitancy campaign that we were with these groups, and then Kaiser came in to fund the effort. We were brought on to find the people who were hesitant and engage in those moments. That was kind of the initial part we were brought into. And we were supposed to send them to the best practices. Hey, CDC will have literature on this. Some of the health groups have literature. And we looked at what people were engaging, and we looked at this stuff, and it's like, oh, you're hesitant. You should get vaccinated for your family. Well, I'm hesitant because I don't believe this is good for me. That's going to be pointless. And don't pressure me. Or now there's this big thing on future regret ideas. You don't want to kill grandma. Well, you know, I don't, I'm serious. This is like now, like this is the like a lot of academia, this is what we got to do to fix this problem. It's like, no, give them information. They don't like, just give them resources, meet them where they are, let them. And so our whole thing, it's our vaccine, your decision. And one of our ads was find out if the vaccine's right for you. And like health, you can't, what do you mean? How can it not be right for them? And it's like, well, they're questioning right now. We need to meet them in this place. And when they're hesitant, like if you're African-American, there's a good reason to have some concerns about whether these things are represented, whatever. But you know what? This was the first vaccine trial ever that was fully inclusive. 1 in 3 participants were people of color. It's been tested, and we've all seen the like reporting on the testing as well. Like, oh, 30,000 people in Moderna trial or whatever. Over 200,000 Americans have participated in this trial because we tested a bunch. And you help people understand that. And then if you're hesitant because, well, I know people like me are never included fully, I have these bad experiences. And you see that, I'm not saying you're wrong to have those bad experiences. And I'm not saying this is totally safe, you should do it. But I'm giving, you now have these little bits of information that help. And another big piece is we showed people who did the vaccine. And Dr. Corbett, who was behind the NIH creator of the vaccine, well, she looks like the black, that vaccine hesitant community, African-American woman, the head of the American Medical Association, who was responsible for oversight on, and like the medical outside approval on the process and these pieces, happened providentially to be the first ever African-American woman to head AMA during this period. And we can show here the people behind the vaccine. And again, that's not saying, hey, it's absolutely right, but for that concern of how do I know they're not just going to experiment on me and all that stuff? You don't. But do you think she would? Because she did it. And it just starts a different sort of conversation. I was a poli-sci major in college. I'm a PK, but had as that, there we go. As that, and you grow up as one, and you're always asked, well, so are you going to be, my dad, are you going to be a preacher like your dad? And I always said no, which was interesting thing, but I just never felt that was, I never felt called to that, and had that context as a kid to that. And then I went to college, and I went to Davidson, and I played football there too, and I was president of Fellowship of Christian Athletes. And I started, take way too long to get through the call story side, but long story short, I through that role, started to increasingly get all kinds of questions, and that realized as a 19-year-old, I was ill-equipped to answer on, my grandmother died, let's talk, or why is this thing about the Bible? So there was a learning side to it. But I also saw, I played football, I was on student government, and I was an RA, how many people were coming to me and saying, I go to church, I feel like I can talk to you, like you understand me. And I just don't feel that way about, like, I don't know my pastor that well, that there was a real opportunity for ministry outside of service. I mean, outside of the parish. And so that was part of what took me to Divinity School. And I got a Master of Public Policy as well. there, where I felt this calling to that ministry and other service. And that's where I was moving. And I worked at the Pentagon, and had originally thought I was going to be doing more in the kind of peacekeeping and State Department sort of line. Realized that the executive branch side was you were able to make a big difference, on a very small point. And I wanted to do more, and ended up going to the Hill and worked for Senator Kennedy out of grad school on the Help Committee, which was an incredible experience. And then from there to the House, where I worked for Congressman David Price, who's a Yale Div grad, and that's part of why I made that move. And started the nascent First Democratic Faith Working Group on the House. So Peter, and then jump forward now to your question. I did my first campaign in 2004, where I ran the coordinated campaign field in North Carolina. I'm a Duke Div, back at Duke. So, and where I'd worked as a youth pastor for 3 years, I knew a lot of the pastors, and this was the God Gap year, where the best indicator you're going to vote for Bush in 2004 was that you went to church on a weekly basis. And I had a bunch, more than party ID. It was, did you go to church on a weekly basis? And I had all these Christian friends, as I'm organizing and doing, who say, Eric, I'm going to vote for Kerry, but I also don't feel like they want me. I feel like there's not a place for me in the party. I'd experienced that pretty heavily in my work on the Hill, that I would often be introduced. He went to Divinity School, but he's okay, sort of thing. I literally had policy taken away from me in the committee staff because I was a Christian, and so I couldn't be trusted by others. And so like I got that, and to me it was this idea: Democrats shouldn't be losing on the Bible. But to your question, Peter, my goal set out was not to make Christians Democrat or to sit this vote, but what I argued, I left the Hill and started the first firm working with Democrats on faith outreach, was you all need to fund me to make Christians the perpetual swing voters, because right now they're voting 80% Republican on these weekly church attenders. America doesn't think that's right. We don't think they're right. If they go to 70%, we've got perpetual governing majorities moving forward forever. Actually, at that point, a 5% swing in the white Christian vote would have been equivalent to 100% African-American turnout at the polls. And like, there was all this attention on the one. It's not that you do the one instead of the other, but you see elections are about math. And to ignore all that low-hanging fruit was, I thought, a mistake. And so we went in and this was my foundation, which carries over into our data now. We came in and I said, what we need to do is, like, we're not going to win these people over by lecturing at them or trying to preach, or I can't write a bunch of speeches for you, candidate, convincing people these Christians need to vote for me. And they're not voting for us because we're kind of looking down our nose at them and we haven't been including them. We need to listen. And so we set up, and I worked in 2006 on Jennifer Grant. I was in senior Granholm, Ted Strickland, Governor Sebelius, Sherrod Brown, Tim Kaine, and the Michigan Democratic Party, North Carolina Democratic Party, Oregon Democratic Party, all because Democrats were desperate. This was like a 2010, we were out of everything. And they had nothing better to do than to trust a 20-some-year-old without much experience, but had these ideas. And we said, we need to hold listening meetings. And I am going to tell you, candidates, you're coming in and all you get to do is ask questions. No stump speeches, no nothing. We get it sponsored by a pastor that invites people in, and our goal is to listen. And our goal is to ask. And we were coming into these pro-life settings, these very conservative settings. Held in Michigan, we held 125 of them mostly in Western Michigan. And Michigan's a great example because at the end of that series, we were creating really good, if you're familiar with Michigan, the CRC, Christian Reformed and Reformed Church of America, which are pretty evangelical, conservative, CRC in particular. And we were meeting with their heads, their mega church leaders, everybody. And I knew all of them. I had them all on my cell phone now. They'd met with Granholm and others. And we were moving past listening to, like, they were wanting to engage. And we're like, I bet they're going to ask us if they can do something now. We need to think of it. And the Democratic Party was about to rewrite its platform. So I told the party chair, who'd been Mark Brewer, who'd been in all these meetings, I'm like, we should offer to let him help draft the platform. And because he'd been in this meeting, he said, I bet they could do the preamble. I bet we could figure this out. And most of it is still up. The preamble of the Democratic Party platform was written by pro-life, traditional family, evangelical pastors and Catholic priests. And it is beautiful. We helped organize it and work, but they were willing to work with us to say, this is where we share these values. And if you all are giving us voice, we want to help. And you know what evangelical pastors are pretty good at is articulating these visions. Like, that's what the church has done. It can tell a story, it can get people motivated, it can speak to these heartstrings. And Mark Brewer, who was the DNC chair at the time, vice chair at the time, at the convention the next year, stood up and told the story where he said, so we did this thing. I thought it was beautiful. I put it forward, it got voted, it got passed. And the next morning I sat down in my office after it had been published and I opened up my email. And the first 5 emails I had, I knew who they were from. All of them were our atheist, sectarian, elements of the party. And in the subject line, in each one of them, there was something about party platform preamble. And I knew who had written it. And I was like, okay, here it comes. And he says, and I opened it up, and one after the other, they said, thank goodness we're finally speaking with conviction about what it means to be a Democrat. And to these people who were not Christian, because we'd found those core values. I mean, we could be using stuff from a hymn, but we didn't say it was from a hymn. And whenever I worked with candidates, like, you don't quote chapter and verse. If you're gonna, you can use Jesus if you know it and if it's appropriate and authentic. The people in the crowd know it. If you start trying to tell them all the verses, not only does it get cumbersome, but it looks like you're trying too hard. Use it when it's natural, and the people who it's natural for will recognize it, and the other people will say, "Oh, that's a pretty good idea. That resonates." And so that's what we did in 2006. Our candidates outperformed other Democrats by 20 points with white Protestants, by 15 with Catholics. Bob Casey was another one. We beat Santorum using these approaches. The speech that Casey gave at Catholic University was picked up and carried on every Catholic radio station around the country. 200 unique stories were written about it. And that difference in that swing was determinative in every single one of those races, which then, you all may remember this brief little glimpse, and so we were covering New York Times, Time Magazine, on Colbert, all these things. And all of a sudden, hey, Democrats can do faith and values. And I led the D-Trips Red to Blue program in 2008, which was the title of it. Was Values Vets Victory was the kind of name that they gave to it. And worked with another 40 candidates. We saw similar outcomes there. Pew Forum wrote, John, what was his name? Who was the guy at Pew, David? Do you remember? I'm blanking out, but their main leader on faith work back then, they published this big study on the elections on these communities where they said, what Democrats have done in the faith community, if they maintain this, will guarantee, this has established a line across the country that will usher in And we had them, these veto-proof, filibuster-proof majorities moving forward, if they're able to maintain this piece. And then we won. In 2008, there were 22 state parties that had Democratic state parties that had faith outreach staff, that like almost all of them were people that I trained and worked with. And again, what we did was we did listening meetings, we did conversations, we found things, we started. Another key piece to this was in 2008, we rolled out the volunteer tithing program, where I was like, we are generating in our grassroots capacity hundreds and hundreds of millions of hours of volunteer time and raising all this money, all to just get one person elected in each case. Let's tithe 10% of it to community service. And we were told, and the first did it with Tom Perry. I managed Tom Perriello's race, who was in Virginia, ended up being the biggest upset in 2008, Central Southern Virginia. And all the smart consultants said, you can't do, like, that's a waste. You can't waste those resources on, yeah, I know you did well in 2006, but this touchy feel-good stuff, you gotta use it. You can't waste your money. And I was like, well, we're talking about service all the time. We're gonna have to be mobilizing these grass top leaders in 6 months, where we're gonna be coming around door to door, and Black churches too, saying, hey, you need to mobilize your people for us. What better way than to have been serving in their soup kitchens for the 5 months beforehand? And what we learned from the listening meetings, like, you do the stuff for the people, and then you're not, like, they know who you are. There's no better way to meet these leaders and prove that you care about them and understand what the people want than to serve beside them. And so we launched that program, and it turned into not a waste of volunteer time. Every campaign that did it saw a dramatic increase in volunteer participation, because you know what, surprise it may turn out, it's a lot easier to ask your friend to come help for the first time at the Habitat home than why don't we all sit down and call a bunch of strangers and ask them to give money to the campaign. Like, as shocking as that was to the consultants, we had these monster volunteer armies that were all said, they came in, the most exciting part was the tithing and the service. And then they stayed and they knocked on doors and they turned people out. And who runs all the service opportunities? Like, well, it's the pastors, it's the local leaders. It was everyone we needed in the fall. And so by the time we got there, it wasn't, hey, let me tell you why you should vote for me. It was them saying, hey, remember these people that have been serving beside, and of course, again, once it starts working, all the consultants come in, you got to put your button on, make sure you're like, no, they will figure it out. Our goal is not to speak, our goal is to serve. Boom, wins. So we win in 2008. And all of a sudden we've won history. And you know what? To a T, we don't need to talk to those people anymore. The Obama folks came in, and a month after the election, they shut down every single faith outreach office in the country. And we shifted the focus to, now we can finally, we've won enough. We can do what we need to, we can force it. And this is why I said it's actually it's my origin story into data. And I was in some pretty big, I was in some significant conversations in this space. And they'd say, and I'm like, why aren't we doing, those people wouldn't vote for us. I'm like, they just did. Like, they voted like months ago. And it's like, no, our data tells us they won't. And I'm like, what are you talking about? We have election data. And it's like, no, our data tells us this, because all the data they were using was demography data and consumer data. And so as they were building up these new systems, they were only viewing people through the lens of how you're born and what you buy. And these holes in the data that were created from that, and obviously you can say I'm a white guy, but like I was getting really uncomfortable with these conversations that were saying the way we were targeting all of our mobilization, our issues and everything was, if you were Black, we know what matters to you. We know what you care about, and we will get your vote if we talk about this. If you are brown skin, we know what you care about. It's immigration reform. We give you immigration reform, check. If you're a woman, yep, it's abortion. We know what you care about, check. That's the woman's issue. The only group that in our own strategies, we said, let's try to understand what's happened in their life to know and how they identify themselves now to decide how to win them, were people that looked like me. And so for all these other groups, we knew their issues. And like we all know we've heard the language that these are the issues, that apply. And the underlying assumption in that is that there's one group that as soon as you're born, you kind of know. And the only other ones we didn't were like white men, which again, as a Democrat, seemed very alien. So our mission had always been, I fought a lot of fights in that and had a lot of scars from it. Our mission was always to align what's right with what works. And that goes back, if you read the Embracing the Gray piece, that's, I'm a Calvinist, Reformed, like it's that there has to be, it's not enough. And because of the privilege I'm aware of too, and that I've enjoyed, like it's a stewardship piece, the luxury of saying I lost the good fight is not something I feel I can, that's not something I can bear in our work. That we have to be able to compromise on things. We have to be able to figure out a way to make it work, because I will go home to a perfectly good house and salary, and the people that we are speaking on behalf of don't have that luxury. And so often we were seeing this divide, which happened in Democratic and a lot of progressive politics over that last decade, which quite frankly but set up a lot of Trump, was this, it was more the economic pieces and what Brad had talked about, and the unwillingness for all of us with our advanced degrees at places like Berkeley, but all on the coasts that are really woke and wake up and understand these things, who were not, we were okay fighting fights that, we were pure, but we lost, as the country was just, most of the country was just getting slaughtered and worrying, and opioids and all these sort of things. So I actually wrote an exit memo in 2010 that right before the election that became very Cassandra-esque. Maybe I'll send that in before our next class, because it was talking about a lot of the stuff that ended up happening by the time Trump came around, saying if we continue down this path, and it was, again, I was a white guy, but I was talking, our faith program, when I was doing faith work, I was told Democrats had a program for Black churches. It was our base turnout. It was GOTV. And I was always told very clearly, stay in your lane. We've got that taken care of, so you deal with the white churches. And as we'd start going, without fail, the pastors would, because they're pastors, would start saying, I want to be in that guy's program, because he's coming earlier and he's treating me as a pastor, not a GOTV operative. And so I was hearing all these different pieces as we were moving, and said, so, okay, 2010's come around. We're moving away from the party stuff to the organizing. We need to start developing data that helps a fuller understanding of who people are. And what we saw at the core of so much of this was the values that motivate us to come together. And when you look at people through their shared values and beliefs, it's a very important way to understand and connect with them. But it also just gives you a different perspective on who they are. You see that white evangelicals can be one, And you don't have to sell out your beliefs to do it. You just need to engage in different ways. And also different minority groups, if you just treat them all the same, you will lose some, and you will rightly lose some because of what you're doing. So we started in that concept with the data, and then that brought us much more into the digital engagement space. But from 2009 until this last election, I didn't do anything in Democratic politics. There wasn't a place for what we were doing. And even as we were developing our data, Catalyst, which is the largest Democratic voter file, in 2012, and because I knew the directors there, we said, hey, we've got this really important thing, and I think we can make, I think it can become modelable data that could be an overlay on the voter file. And she believed it. And so she gave us, you know, anyone else to use it was $250,000 a year subscription, and tasked her, the fact that it was not algorithms, it was PhDs, modelers, to work with us to create these faith models, which became the first ones that ever worked. And they came online for 2012 and 2014. And where they worked and a lot of others didn't was, it was values-based. It wasn't, we didn't try to model a Presbyterian because, you know, or a Methodist in Mississippi looks very different from a Methodist in Massachusetts. And my goal wasn't to, again, categorize people, was to connect with them. So we found these core values pieces that then quickly we realized it was more than faith, and these applied outside. So Catalyst created these models. This is the Democratic voter file. They validated these models. We had buy-in from the top to push these. And after 2014, they said, we're just gonna have to, and like, there's not a point in keeping your contract. We couldn't find a single person willing to use them in our advocacy group or the campaign side, because this just isn't what you know, because of this cultural divide. So we kind of went from being in the wilderness to having this outreach to then going back. And then, but this last cycle, we ended up doing a big push on the disinformation, counter disinformation space. We did all of Black Lives Matters, digital get out the vote. We then created and spun up the Evangelicals for Biden group using those same tools and pieces, and we focused on Michigan and Georgia. And so there you go. Now you get me going on long stories and we see what happens. 15 minutes after you start, what happened in 2006, where we saw these shifts, and then everyone's lost, and we all know evangelicals, and boy, the harm to the Christian witness with this sellout to Trump. And we know they are sold out, they're doing whatever. We had a 17-point swing in the white evangelical vote in Michigan. It was absolutely determinative. In Georgia, I think it was a 12-point swing. That was different. There were a lot of other things that make the difference. There was a lot of good work that made that difference, but without that, we would not have won those states.
How has the digital revolution changed American religion and politics? And how can it make if our spirituality and politics are in trouble, how can the digital revolution help us get out of trouble?
With our own data that we had, which I don't call so much our data anymore, we had these very large data sets on 100 million Americans on these core values. I told you why we were creating them to counter the system. And we were doing a campaign on climate. And I was watching our dashboard, and there were 2 million people engaging in this moment on something I'd written a week ago, and taking actions of engaging their members of Congress and sharing with their friends about this piece. And I had this very deep, all of a sudden, this understanding, it's in one of the Medium posts, but that what we were dealing with was not ones and zeros. It wasn't data. It wasn't a way to sell people. That every one of those data points we had represented a moment of hope and intent that someone had. and because of our campaigns, where someone felt they could make a difference and were acting. And that collection of moments was really nigh on to sacred. That the idea, like the early church believed in the Eucharist and communion, that we literally went out of space and time to be in communion with all the saints. And what technology and data allows us, and I do this with churches, when I talk to churches about it, is we actually have a way to engage people outside of space and time. And that, like, when we talk about how does God, when asked to explain and define, I am. It is in the moment and the present. And theologically, like if you get into dimensional theory and everything, it's remarkable how effective, how the idea of eternity and other things are not that hard to explain if you think of a fourth dimensional perspective on our world that is removed from space and time. And data allows us to create those connections, and technology allows us to create those connections. That sermon that you wrote could be the perfect sermon for someone 2 years from now. And in our current environment, like, you don't get to give it then.
You mainly talked about the faith communities. What about how does the digital revolution affected our politics, and how is it going to fix our politics?
Right now in our politics, if George Soros gives $1 million for a campaign, maybe $200,000 of that is spent on the actual ads. By the time the admin cut is taken from the nonprofit that got it, and they hire their consultants who take the cut, and they hire their consultants, and it goes into the digital space. There's a reason. Beto O'Rourke, like we also saw, like he set all these huge fundraising numbers. He raised whatever it was, $87 million from small donors. Isn't this amazing? He spent $67 million raising that $87 million out of state. So he raised $87 million. He spent most of that money talking to people who weren't his voters, who already agreed with them, to get him to give more money. That wasn't because Beto had some great strategy. That's because everyone in the middle of that was taking a cut. And the current cuts in the digital market are about 60% margins. So that's one of the main reasons our system's not working. And it's also part of my stepping out of the system for a while. And that system feeds itself. That's where the digital market is broken right now in the Democratic space. It's why Biden turns over fundraising to small dollar donors, because of those same systems. Until that's fixed, we're going to continue to have we're going to have a brokenness there, because it's too skewed in the needs and priorities. And it's why Democrats, continue to be willing to lose to do the same old things. It is really, having been in it, deeply in it, and watched it, and watched all the back dealing and the I'll hire you for this campaign, but you need to give me 10% of everything you get paid as a standard. That's one of the brokenness in our system. It was one of the things working with Fair Fight that was just amazing. I've never worked with a more dedicated, smarter organization. Everything they were about was about impacts, new things. Like, look what happened to Stacey Abrams in Georgia in the last election. And their entire mantra was, we can't win with just our people. Those same people who were cheating, doing whatever, I've got to find a way to win over some of those voters. And that was such a foreign concept in Democratic politics until she started really pushing it and living it. And we now have a Senate majority as a result. So I think in our politics, it happened on the Republican side too, with the margins. Like, this system is really inefficient in breaking. That's the opportunity, is that as people decide, the technology becomes easier for normal people to use. And at some point enough people are going to want to win, that they're going to realize that they can be much more effective with it. And when they do, the solution is, like, you don't run an $80,000 phone poll to decide what you're, with 60-second questions in each of them, to decide what you're going to put on a 10-word banner. You run 90 of those 10-word banners into the community, and you use those 100 million impressions as your focus group to decide what those people need to hear and learn. And that system can improve. The faith community should be sitting, when done right, at this nexus of what people value and the service model. There's obviously twisted versions, even into Q is quasi now faith, but I'm talking about what I'd consider more legitimate faith groups. That's same as when Democrats, when I first started in 2004, were like, we don't know, we're lost. We need a way to win. We need a way to connect to people. What is it? There's an opportunity for faith community, and you see it in the organizers. We delineate, like, community organizers, it's Democrats, especially when going to Black. Oh, those are community organizers. They're safe. They're good. They're just nice community organizers. Obviously, a lot of them are people of faith. They're faith groups. They're doing it for faith, but you put the community organizer label on it. All the groups that are serving on the ground have a special value because they understand the market, whether that's business, political, whatever. And the system shift is going to be the tipping point of the decision makers, the power brokers, and the people with money either not having another choice but to do that, but to reach out and understand those people, or having that value so apparent that they claim it on their own.
So Eric, we're so grateful. You're very generous. You're really generous to give us this time.
We need to expand the ideas that we're doing, have more people adopt them, take them to the next level of application and insight and everything else too. So thank you all for all your time, for taking
Thank you,
the
Eric.
time
You're a
through
good
these
friend
years.
and you're an outstanding presenter. Thanks a lot.
I have really enjoyed and been honored by the time we've spent together, David, and all you've done.